Hi, everyone. Thank you for watching this video and listening to the story that I have to tell as far as my testimony is concerned. And I'm going to try to not make this extremely long, but at the same time, there's no way I can make it extremely short. But anyway, you'll see the time markers there on the video. I don't really know what this will turn out to be honest. But let me just go ahead and get started with my testimony. My name is Dexter Wooten. I'm from a small, very small town in Northwest Georgia in the United States, not Georgia the country, but Georgia the state in the US. And I'm here to talk about just my basic testimony, the way that I was saved and the way that I came into the family of God. So basically, I grew up in what many people may know as the Bible Belt. And I'm sure that many people do. I'm sure that many Christians in America grew up in this environment. It's interesting to grow up in the Bible Belt because some people just so easily conform to this like a Christian traditionalist background that they're surrounded in, sometimes for better or worse, because a lot of things become Christian tradition instead of strictly Christian, if that makes any sense. So some things feel like they have, some traditions, I guess, feel like they have actually come from Christianity, but they've sort of changed in some way and become not necessarily a Christian sort of thing. And I won't go into that so much, but anyway, that's just my own opinion on that. And I guess that I've always been skeptical in the strictest sense about a lot of things. I've always been kind of a question asker, why, what, who, that's just always been the way ever since I was a little boy. And even as a young kid, I realized just how many things weren't as they appeared. And I questioned how genuine anyone was about basically anything. And I still am this way to some extent, but just like Santa Claus or the Easter Bunny or the Tooth Fairy, were eventually revealed to me as a child to be fictitious. I believed that just following the line of reasoning, well, Jesus's day must be coming too. They eventually told me these things weren't real. I guess at some point they'll probably tell me Jesus wasn't real either, because let's be honest, is Jesus any more realistic than the Tooth Fairy or Santa Claus or the Easter Bunny? And of course now I feel differently about that, but as a young kid, Jesus didn't seem any more or less realistic than those other characters. So that was just my thinking on that matter. And, I kind of waited thinking my parents would eventually tell me something to that effect, which never did happen, by the way. And so I started to go back and forth with the idea of believing in God. I wasn't willing to say I did believe definitely, but I wasn't able to say, oh, I definitely don't believe in God. I was never I shouldn't say never. I wasn't at a point of where I felt very sure either way. But as time went on, I got more and more involved with the church, if for no other reason, just the fact that my mother and I went to church. Well, my mother and father and I went to church on Sundays, but then my mother and I would go on Wednesdays also. And I was sort of pushed into the Wednesday night youth group class, more or less against my will. I didn't really want to go, but they made me go. And I just ended up being in awe of the youth pastor. I thought he was just the coolest guy ever. And it's not just the fact that I looked up to him, but it was also the fact that he would get up and he would just preach in such an interesting way. And I'm not even sure if I'd really say the word preach, but I guess that's what he was doing. He would teach us from scripture. And it wasn't just the fact that I thought he was cool. It was the fact that he seemed to have a connection, and he seemed to have a method in a way that I could not figure to be anything other than God directly communicating with me. I'll try to say that in more layman's terms. I was totally convinced the guy could read my mind. I was totally convinced of it, because when he would speak, my mind would go off. I would always be, I would try to be a step ahead of people when they spoke. My mind just sort of wanders, and my mind just sort of, I'll hear something and just, I'll start running away with it. And sometimes I'll just go way out in left field with it. But whenever he spoke, every week, more or less, as far as I can remember, every single week, it's like as soon as I thought something, he would address that. Or as soon as I asked a question, he would address that question. Or as soon as, and it wasn't so linear. It wasn't so predictable. I mean, sometimes like with a speech, you could do something like this, but this was different. This was like, my mind would be all over the place, and somehow he would follow it to the point that it made no sense at all that he would be able to do this unless he could read my mind, or unless God was actually directing him, because obviously God, being omniscient and omnipresent and all knowing and all these sorts of things, he would be able to see what I was thinking, and he would be able to direct my youth pastor in what he was saying. And I firmly believe to this day that there was divine intervention, if you want to call it that, going on there. And so anyway, he just sort of followed my logic, and it was surreal, which is a word I don't like to overuse, but it felt totally surreal. And I was more amazed at this process than anything else. And for reference, this was over 15 years ago at this point. And I was spending a lot of time with him, and he was very, very, very firm in his belief, and he didn't care who knew it. And he was just totally unashamed, not embarrassed at all. And it wasn't like we'll talk about God because we're in church and that's what we talk about in church. He was very, very honored, very glad, very proud. A lot of people would say. I try not to use that word so flippantly either, but he was very unashamed of his faith. And I mean, I would call it his certainty in God's involvement with his life. And it was this that really helped me see that God was very real and involved, because I could see God's involvement with his life, which was something I wasn't really used to. Like I said, I grew up in the Bible Belt, but a lot of the culture in the Bible Belt is that you go to church on Sundays, and then as soon as the church service lets out, God is just off the table as far as conversation or lifestyle until church. God was in church and God's relevance was in church, but it didn't seem to be relevant anywhere else really. And so anyway, so that was my ordeal with my youth pastor. And it was really on a youth trip that I went on, of course, that he took us on. He led this and directed this and all this. And I started to get to really know him there personally. And just through talking with him over time, he just helped lead me to Christ in the most textbook way, I guess you'd say. I mean, he became a youth pastor and he preached the word of God, and just he led this young skeptical boy to Jesus in that way. And it's funny because I've always sort of had, I've always sort of felt like this sort of testimony is kind of boring, like kind of uninteresting in a way. I mean, I think most people really like just to hear great stories, especially where, someone's at a really low point and then they get to a really high point. Like I love hearing stories about people that were firmly, very, very, I don't know, addicted to drugs. They were hooked on drugs and they lost everything to drugs. And then they found Jesus in prison or something, or someone tried to kill themselves or they almost died. And then they found Jesus, things like that, these more tragic feeling sort of stories. And so I always thought, my testimony is kind of boring in comparison. But then, one time, and this is a side note, this isn't really my testimony. This is my feelings about my testimony. But I remember one day, it was actually on my birthday a few years ago, I happened to meet a man who told me his testimony, which was very short, very sweet, very to the point. And he just said, I've loved the Lord my whole life. Every day, my whole life, I've loved the Lord for my whole life. And when he told me that, I thought, you know what? That's a great testimony. That's a really great testimony. My whole life, that consistency, that whole picture, and that's when I started to think, my testimony, it's all right. My testimony is good. I'll take it. And so that's just me, a little bit about my life and the way that I found Jesus. And I later on went to Covenant College, which is the official Presbyterian church, the official college of the Presbyterian Church of America. I've never necessarily labeled myself as Presbyterian, or not even necessarily Reformed, but that's doctrinal stuff. Won't get into all that today either. And I'm a worship leader at my church, but I suppose it's more like I'm in a worship band and we play in different churches. And so I've been very involved with my church, or even you might say multiple churches, all these years later. And so that's just who I am, and that's what I'm doing now. And I've been traveling the world and also trying to share Jesus with people in other countries. And that's just what I'm all about. And this was my testimony, and I hope you enjoyed and pulled something from this. And I hope that there's something that connects with you. And I enjoyed doing this. Thank you very much. Have a nice day.